Once upon a time in feudal Japan, there lived a young samurai named Yuki. He possessed a sharp mind and a grandiose dream to become the greatest swordsman in his province. Yuki spent hours studying treatises on famous battles, meticulously planning his future triumphs, and enthusiastically telling his clansmen how he would master the most complex combat techniques. He sincerely believed that the sheer scale of his ambitions and the clarity of his goals were a guarantee of inevitable greatness. However, every time the morning mist cleared over the training field, Yuki found an objective reason to postpone his practice. Sometimes the weather seemed too damp for training, sometimes a slight ailment demanded rest, or he simply decided he needed a few more days just to better rethink his action plan. Years passed. His dreams grew more and more grandiose, while his actual skills remained modest. The young men who had started at the same time as him trained daily, without unnecessary words, in any weather. Soon, they surpassed Yuki in everything. When the time came for his first serious trial, Yuki faced a harsh reality. His massive dreams had not elevated him above the rest, but instead made him weak, unprepared, and vulnerable. The psychology of public intentions and the Golvitzer effect. Yuki's story is not just a parable about laziness, it is a classic illustration of a fundamental flaw in the human psyche, one that modern cognitive science has been studying for the past few decades. His main mistake was that he constantly stated his goals publicly. In a study by German psychologist Peter Golvitzer, When Intentions Go Public, a phenomenon that destroys familiar stereotypes about motivation was experimentally proven. Golvitzer and his colleagues conducted a series of experiments to test how public statements affect our actions. One of the studies involved law and psychology students striving to build a successful career. They were divided into two groups and given 45 minutes to perform a complex task that brought them closer to their goal. In Group 1, students were asked to write down their specific plans for this work. Then the experimenter carefully read their answers aloud and confirmed their intentions. That is, the participants received social acknowledgement of their goals. In Group 2, students also wrote down their plans, but no one read their questionnaires. Their intentions remained completely hidden. Students from the first, open group quit the task after an average of just 33 minutes. When asked why they stopped, they replied that they felt already close enough to their goal. The students from the second, hidden group worked for the entire 45 minutes from start to finish, and afterwards stated that they still had a very long way to go. Why did this happen? According to Symbolic Self-Completion Theory, when a person loudly announces their intentions, "I will become a great warrior, I will learn a language, I will write a book," and receives an approving nod from others, their brain falls into a trap. It perceives this social acknowledgement as confirmation that you have already partially achieved success. Talking creates an illusion of progress, completely stripping you of the motivation to do the actual, routine, and uncomfortable work. To understand why Yuki was paralyzed in the face of training, we need to descend to the level of neurochemistry and break down how the mesolimbic dopamine system works. For a long time in pop psychology, dopamine was mistakenly called the pleasure hormone. However, a fundamental meta-analysis by researchers John Salamone and Mercedes Correa in 2012 finally overturned this perception. Dopamine is not responsible for hedonistic pleasure, liking, which is managed by the brain's opioid system, but for motivational drive and the willingness to overcome obstacles, wanting. Salamone's experiments showed that rats with artificially depleted dopamine levels still derived pleasure from food, but they were absolutely unwilling to take even a few steps or jump over a small barrier to reach a more substantial portion. They chose the easily accessible but meager food right in front of their noses. Dopamine is the molecule that evaluates the cost of effort. When our samurai Yuki sat on the veranda and imagined his triumphs, his brain experienced a so-called phasic dopamine spike. Vividly imagining success and receiving praise from his peers provided a cheap, easy neurochemical surrogate for victory. But when Yuki approached the training sword, his prefrontal cortex faced the need to make a physical effort, to enter the zone of discomfort. At this moment, the brain performed an instantaneous mathematical calculation of the cost-benefit ratio. Since the baseline dopamine level had already been satisfied by fantasies, the expected value of actual sweat and pain sharply plummeted. The brain signaled, why spend calories on heavy physical exercise if the mental status of a successful warrior has already been obtained? This led to procrastination, which Yuki disguised as searching for ideal conditions. The greatest swordsman of the early 17th century, Miyamoto Musashi, wrote in his immortal work, The Book of Five Rings, Go-Rin no Sho. In strategy and in everyday life, your spirit must remain unchanging. Live in such a way that action precedes the thought of its difficulty. Musashi intuitively grasped what in modern clinical psychology is called behavioral activation. This is a core element of cognitive behavioral therapy. Its key postulate states, a change in behavior must precede a change in emotional state, not the other way around. Most people make the same mistake Yuki did. They wait for a spark of motivation to start acting. But in the actual architecture of the human brain, this cycle works in the opposite direction. According to functional MRI studies led by Brian Kotzen, 2001, dopamine activity reaches its sustained peak not during passive waiting or at the completion of a process, but precisely during the registration of incremental, even minimal progress toward a goal. Motivation is not a prerequisite for action. Motivation is a kinetic effect that arises within the action itself. The moment you make that first physical movement, the motor cortex activates the frontal lobes, overcoming the primary resistance of the amygdala, the fear of discomfort, and triggers a dopamine feedback loop. Action creates momentum, and momentum generates the very energy we mistakenly call inspiration. Now, imagine one of Yuki's comrades. He did not have such grandiose ambitions, nor did he build perfect strategies, but every morning, in any weather, he went out onto the platform and performed the exact same sword form. He didn't wait for the perfect mood, he just did it. Without knowing it, he was obeying the laws of neuroarchitecture and the concept of adaptive myelination. In 2014, the journal Nature Neuroscience published a breakthrough study by a team of scientists led by Ian McKenzie. Motor learning requires myelination. The researchers proved that when mastering any new skill, the key role is played not only by the neurons themselves, but also by the cells that form the myelin sheath around nerve pathways. Myelin is a biological insulating tape. When an electrical impulse repeatedly travels along the same neural pathway, for example, during the daily repetition of a single strike, cells are activated that intensively wrap this nerve in layers of myelin. The speed of signal transmission increases tens of times. The temporal synchronization of movements becomes perfect. As Cristina Sampaio-Baptista's neuroimaging analysis demonstrated, this process shifts the control of an action from the energy-consuming prefrontal cortex to the basal ganglia, subcortical structures responsible for hardwired automatic habits. Where Yuki needed to burn a colossal resource of willpower just to force himself to lift his sword, his comrade acted on autopilot. Regular practice turned a complex movement into an unconditional reflex. In the end, one small but consistent action proved incomparably more powerful than the most flawless yet uninitiated plan. Yuki's internal crisis was predicted centuries ago by the great Zen teacher and samurai mentor Takuan Soho in his philosophical letter to Yagyu Munenori, known as The Unfettered Mind, 1638. Soho warned against the sickness of the mind, a state where a warrior's mind stops clinging to reflections, doubts, expectations of ideal conditions, or the fear of failure. The samurai countered this with the concept of Mushin, no mind. It is a state of absolute presence in the moment of action, where there is no room for lengthy reflections on whether you feel like training right now or not. This fully echoes the Stoic philosophy of Epictetus and his dichotomy of control. Our fleeting emotions, laziness, fear of discomfort, and the weather outside are all outside our zone of control. But our current physical action is entirely under the control of our will. The great master Yagyu Munenori left us a formula that should serve as the final point in our search for excuses. The sword that waits for ideal conditions never leaves its scabbard. If you wait for the right moment, you will wait forever. Preparation without practice is disguised procrastination. Publicly talking about your goals is the neurochemical theft of your own future. Waiting for inspiration is voluntarily handing over control of your life to unstable emotions. Discipline is not the absence of resistance. It is the ability to move through it. True strength never says, "I feel like doing this." True strength picks up the sword and calmly states, "I will do this right now, regardless of how my body feels."